Welcome to the Church of Obelisk and to this mid-tier list for patch 732C, the TI11 patch. This list is based primarily on stats from Immortal level pub games, and we'll start right away with the S tier. These are heroes that are just overpowered, just very strong right now in the mid lane, and the first is going to be Leshrac. We've seen him in a lot of TI, he's great in mid lane, he's also perfectly fine in the off lane. And this hero is just a powerhouse. He just has so much AoE damage. He's hard to shut down. He is an extremely strong Bloodstone builder. And with the recent buffs to Bloodstone, this hero is just amazing. Next, we've got Arc Warden, who is a bit of a greedy mid laner, but can actually do quite well because his magic build is just insane. And you still go for the traditional Midas into Maelstrom, into Boots of Travel build, but then you go not into Mjolnir like you did in the old days, but you go into Gleipnir and you get an Aghanim's at some point, and you're just going to be laying down a lot of Spark Wraiths. You get the 125 Spark Wraith damage talent at level 20, and you're just going to be getting a Blink Dagger, and you're going to be doing a lot of magic damage, plus some physical damage. And that just is incredibly strong right now, and this hero has amazing win rates. And then we get our boy Visage, who is amazing mid laner as well as an amazing off laner right now. You have a decent laning in the mid lane. You're going to be maxing out Grave Chill most of the time with like a value point in Soul Assumption at some point. You get Gravekeeper's Cloak as your second max, and then once you have your birds up, you're really good at farming and just like pushing the lane. You typically want to stay in the mid lane for a long time, put pressure on the enemy mid tower and take it down ideally. And then you just go into aura items. You get Wraith Pact, you get Drum probably, and you just play around with your team and you be very active. And despite the recent nerfs, Visage just fits really well into the current meta, so he's an amazing pick. Same thing can be said for Lone Druid, who is a bit more situational, though. This is why he's in the A tier. A tier are heroes that are stronger than average, but not necessarily overpowered. The Lone Druid also has amazing win rates. His pick rates are a bit lower. This is why he's not an S tier, but this hero is very strong in games that are suitable towards him. If you're up against the slower kind of carries that take a long time to come online, like an anti-mage or a spectre, Lone Druid can just take down all their buildings before they even reach their fully farmed state. And that's why he's a great last pick in a suitable Lone Druid game. The same thing can be said for Huskar. He has even faster timings than Lone Druid. He's not quite as good as taking down buildings, but he's better at killing heroes. He's a lane dominator and a hero that can just play very high tempo Dota. Because you want to play around being low HP, you're vulnerable to burst, but if the enemy team lacks burst and disable, Huskar can just run over games completely. And we've got Tinker, very annoying hero to play against and just does really well. You want to get up some stacks, especially ancient stacks, and you can farm them with a smoke and just spam laser over and over again. You can get quite farmed and be incredibly annoying to deal with. And Tinker's not necessarily a great hero for competitive games, but in pub games where everything is a bit more disorganized, Tinker really thrives. Next up, we have Lycan, who actually has absolutely bonkers win rates in Divine games. It's around 65%, which is amazing. His pick rate is not as high, so he's very situational, but in games where the enemy team can't really deal with the Lycan properly, he can be incredibly oppressive. And sort of similar to Lone Druid and Huskar and Visage, he should hit very early timings. You will typically go for the Hammer of the Overlord, and you just dominate the game from there. Next, we have Tiny, who is just a very solid mid laner. Of course, has amazing last hitting and denying abilities with his high base damage, plus extra damage from the tree. And this is just a high tempo mid laner that has high burst potential, and you want to be active around the map. And then you can sort of decide whether you want to go into like an Aghanim's build or whether you just want to go more into the right click route. But either way, Tiny is an incredible mid laner. Then we've got Brood Mother, who of course is a very strong cheese hero. She's great in a game where the enemy team can't really deal with Brood Mother well enough, so she's a great last pick. You can also play her as an offlaner, but she's also perfectly fine as a mid laner, and just also fits the meta right now quite well. Mipu, another strong cheese pick. Many mid laners can't really properly stop you from farming, and obviously this hero farms faster than almost anyone, and just hits those insane mid-game timings. Then we have Pango, who's just like a very solid mid laner, great team fighter. These days, people typically go for a Diffusal Blade build, which is very strong. That slow is actually amazing with Pango, as well as the removing all that mana with your Swashbuckle. So this hero just is super solid and basically never a bad pick. We've got Marcy, who's a very situational pick as a mid laner, but the great thing is that she's so flexible. She can be played in literally every role, so people are not going to know what role you're going to be picking her for. So that's a big advantage you have in the draft. And she can still do amazing things in the mid lane and just be a very active, aggressive mid laner. Then we've got Invoker, a very classic mid laner. You can either go for the Quas Exalt route, which is a bit more farm oriented and maybe not quite as strong usually, or you can go for the Quas Vex and be a bit more active around the map. You're willing to earn and possibly Vessel, and you're just going to be active around the map and do a decent amount of right click damage and just be very disruptive with UMPs and stuff like that. And finally, we've got Shadow Fiend, another classic mid laner. Obviously, have huge kill potential with the Shadow Rays, with those stacks that do extra damage and now also slow people. So even as a mid laner, I actually recommend you go for more of a right-click build, but you obviously max out Shadow Rays and Necromastery for the lane. You get your bottles, so you have your mana regen, but then you get into right-click items. You get like BKB, Dragonlance, and from there you get into more right-click items. You get like Shadow Blade, and the Silver Edge is a very strong option. You can even get something like a Daedalus, or even like a Skadi is great because you already deal a lot of damage just out of the gate. So for the most part, I would recommend you play heroes from the S tier or the A tier. These are just the best heroes right now. But you can also perfectly well play these B tier heroes, especially if these heroes that are suitable to a particular game or you're really confident with these kinds of heroes. The first one is going to be Primal Beast. I've seen him a lot at TI. In pub games, though, he's not quite as strong. Just because he's a very high tempo hero. He's great if your team is playing around you. But in a pub environment, he's not going to do quite as well because he doesn't scale as well as some other mid laners. Then we've got Tusk, who's like a very situational mid laner, but in some games he can be great. Puck, traditional mid laner, very solid, nothing wrong with him, just doesn't quite have the oomph of some of these A tier heroes. Mid Pudge used to be like a very noob thing to do, but now it's actually quite solid. Pudge is a very strong core right now. His Agnums is amazing. You can do quite well as a mid laner, as an off laner, even as a carry. Windranger, she's like a solid hero. Nothing wrong with her. She's just like very solo target, pick-off oriented, which can be great in certain games and not that great in others. Then we have our two Spirit Brothers here, Ember Spirit, Storm Spirit. These heroes are pretty solid. Their win rates are not the highest, but they're picked quite frequently, so they may be a little bit overplayed. But they're very solid heroes where you have a lot of control over the game. Same thing with a Bat Rider, very strong controlling hero. Very strong in particular matchups, but not that great in others. Very high tempo hero. Problem with Bat Rider is that if you ever slow down, then you're probably losing the game. So he's not a hero that is all that stable. Dawnbreaker is a very stable hero on the other hand. You can play her in pretty much any role, so picking her early doesn't give away the fact that you want to play her mid. And she's just solid hero, strong team fighter, also high tempo hero. But she does scale a bit better than a Bat Rider. Monkey King, as a mid laner, is very situational. He's good against certain mid laners, especially like the slower melee heroes. In other matchups though, he's just not going to do nearly as well. So if you already know what the enemy mid laner is, then he can be a great pick, but otherwise I would advise to stay away from him. Kotl used to be a very strong mid laner. He's been nerfed a bit, but you know, he's still playable. Outhouse Defecator is a fine hero. He's like a strong right clicker. Just make sure you're not going for the meme hammer build. That one is completely outdated. You just want to go for right click. And obviously you want to get like early BKB and stuff like that. and play around your orb damage. Ragnar is very situational as a mid laner, but he can make him work in certain matchups. Sniper is more like a carry hero from the mid lane, but if that's what you want, he's quite decent at fulfilling that role. He's a strong laner, very great in 1v1, but can be vulnerable to ganks. On the other hand, though, he also has high kill potential if your supports come to gank the enemy laner. TA, sort of similar to Sniper, is more like a kind of carry hero from the mid lane. She does well in certain matches, but now that the small camp has been removed from the mid lane, she's no longer quite as good. Zeus is a pretty solid laner, and obviously you have an amazing Aghanim's, you do a lot of magic damage, but he's quite fragile, and so he's like a decent mid laner. You can make him work, but he's not that great. Lina is a solid mid laner. She can lane just fine against literally any hero in the game, and that is a big strength. You can also go for like a magic build or a physical build. Both are perfectly viable. It's just that this hero is so fragile and kind of relies on certain timings. If you die a couple of times, the game is pretty much over as Lina. So I actually think she's a little bit stronger in the carry role, but either way, she's just not that great right now. And we've got Void Spirit, who is another one of the Spirit heroes, kind of similar to Ember Spirit and Storm Spirit. He offers a lot of control over the game, but it's like a little bit hard to win with him because he's like even more timing oriented and he doesn't scale all that well. So I would generally stay away from him in pub games. Then we get to the C tier. These are heroes that are okay in certain games, but should generally be avoided. So first is Silencer, who is of course very strong as a support hero. As a mid though, he can be a bit vulnerable. You need like a lot of items to really make him work. So you like pretty much have to get an early BKB, otherwise the hero just dies all the time. And if you get your item timings off, you can do like a strong, high tempo kind of game. But I think there's a lot more solid mid laners to choose from. Magnus can work as a mid laner. I think he's just better in the offlane role. Kunkka is like a solid laner. There's nothing wrong with him. He just doesn't really win Dota all that much. His win rate is not the greatest, and so I would tend to stay away from him. Queen of Pain is a very high tempo hero that kind of has to dominate her lane, otherwise she's going to be very weak. So that makes her a bit risky to pick. Morphling is another one of these carry heroes from the mid lane, and he can definitely work, but similar to carry Morphling, he's just very hard to play, and most people cannot play him well enough to justify the pick. That's why his win rates are pretty abysmal. Viper has been nerfed too much. I would not really pick him. He's probably stronger as an offlaner, but even there kind of struggles, so I would just stay away from this hero. And then Death Prophet does fine in the offlane. In the mid lane though, she is a little bit too weak, and you just need your team to like play around you really well to make Death Prophet mid work, and that's not going to happen in most pub games. And then finally the last tier, D tier heroes. These are heroes that I just would not pick in mid pretty much ever. First is going to be Mars. He's okay as an offlaner, but as a mid laner I think he's just very lacking, doesn't scale well enough. Timbersaw, again, fine offlaner. As a mid laner is very lacking. There's just not enough trees in mid lane, and the hero falls off too fast to be a viable mid laner in my opinion. Rubik is just not a mid laner. People keep trying that, but it's just not good. Scaroth Mage, same thing. You would have to have like such an incredibly strong game on Scaroth to really justify him as a mid lane. Just pick him as a support. You do almost as much as a mid Scaroth with much less farm. Necrophos, he just doesn't work too well in the mid lane right now. There's too many counters. There's all these like spirit vessels and so on that make Necrophos just rather dubious. If you have to play him as an offlaner, but even that is not that great. And then Takiro, again, like why are you playing the support hero as a mid laner? It's just not good. If you absolutely have to play him as a core, play him as an offlane, but probably don't. Just play him as a support. He's fine as a support, but as a mid laner, He just doesn't do enough. So that's my list for the mid lane. If you think I've missed any heroes, let me know in the comment section. Also let me know if any heroes you think should be rated higher or lower. And before you go, click on one of these videos on the screen. You can see my other tier lists for carry and for pos 5. And Obel is willing, I'll see you there.